Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Nicole Smith and I'm the Benefits Education Specialist here at Flex. I head up all of our educational efforts for insurance producers, plan administrators, and plan participants. Just a few housekeeping items to start us off. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you have questions at any point during the presentation, you can type them in using the questions function on your webinar control panel. And I will attempt to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about what's been happening in Washington with the Republican efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act and Trump's impact on President Obama's signature law. If you've been paying any attention at all lately to the news, then you obviously know that it's been a crazy couple of months in Washington, to say the least. Today, I'm going to break it down for you and try to give you a clear picture of everything that's happened, where we stand right now, and where we go from here. Before we get started, though, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Flex and talk about who we are and what we do. Flex is a benefits administrator and general agency located in Chicago, Illinois, and we've been in the business for nearly 30 years now. As a general agency, we provide concierge-like services for insurance producers, which include assistance with sales, service, marketing, and other business processing functions. We are the only general agency in Illinois to offer Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and United Healthcare. As a benefits administrator, we offer consumer-driven accounts and compliance services. Our products include FSAs, HSAs, HRAs, and commuter plans, as well as services like COBRA administration, ERISA wrap document preparation, and non-discrimination testing. Our plans include features like integrated debit cards and automated claims technology, as well as an easy-to-use participant portal and mobile application. We have over 3,200 employer clients and more than 200,000 plan participants nationwide. You can learn more by visiting us online at www.flexiblebenefit.com. Okay, now that I've told you a little bit about Flex, let's jump right into talking about Trump's impact on the Affordable Care Act. We can pretty much sum it up by saying that so much has happened, but so little has been accomplished. And let's go over what we're talking about here. First, let's talk about why the Republicans want to repeal the ACA so badly. You know, for the past 7 years, that's pretty much all we've heard from them. Obamacare has to go. But why? Why are they so opposed to this law? Well, it turns out that there's really some pretty valid reasons for why they feel the ACA is not working for the American people. First, there's the very real concern that the insurance markets are collapsing. You know, the ACA completely changed the face of the individual insurance market, and not always for the better. Here are some of the negative effects that we've been seeing. It's been reported that 1/3 of counties have only one insurer offering exchange plans. Even worse, CMS just released a study saying that 45 counties would have absolutely no exchange plans available in 2018. We are seeing more and more carriers either get out of the exchanges or get out of the individual market altogether. Also, 18 of the 23 co-ops that were, in a sense, kind of created by the ACA have failed. Here in Illinois, we saw this firsthand with the Land of Lincoln. One interesting statistic that I read about them is that for every $100 they took in as premium, they paid out $1,000 in claims. Obviously, that is not a sustainable business model. And many carriers are seeing these same types of losses, which is why both the premiums and the deductibles have been soaring. Right now, the average premium increase for exchange plans is right around 25%, which many people just can't afford. And that's leading us to start seeing an increase in a new kind of uninsured people, or maybe really it's more like an underinsured person. These are people who have health insurance, but their deductibles are so high that they can't afford to see the doctor or fill their prescription. Or maybe they could only afford a plan with an extremely narrow network, so they really don't have access to care in their areas. For these types of people, the ACA really isn't helping as much as it was intended. In addition, the ACA has created $1 trillion in new taxes, and many of those fall on families and job creators. So yeah, there's definitely some indications here that the ACA needs to be fixed. However, the Republican issues with this law actually go pretty far beyond that. So let's talk about some of the other reasons why they want to get rid of the ACA. Well, federal deregulation for one. Republican legislators and their voters are really against this idea of big government. They don't want the federal government to have too much control over their lives. In fact, they really want to give that control back to the states. The feeling here is that the states know their populations the best, so they should be the ones who are making these types of decisions. There's also the sense that all of these rules and regulations hurt innovation. The ACA has over 45,000 pages of rules that need to be followed, and some Republicans are concerned that there is just not enough freedom left in the market. They also believe that we can drive prices down by allowing insurance companies to compete across state lines, which is something that's really not allowed for now. Lastly, they want to eliminate the healthcare taxes imposed by the ACA and expand HSAs. HSAs have sort of been a pet project of Republicans, and they really want to make them both more widely used and more beneficial to Americans. I want to back up for 1 second here, though, because there's something that I'd like to clear up. Everyone, the media, the Republicans, the Democrats, they all keep talking about repeal and replace, repeal and replace. But did you know that this Republican Congress will likely never be able to repeal the ACA in its entirety? That's because in order to repeal a law, you need a supermajority vote in the Senate. That means 60 votes are needed to repeal, which they do not currently have. And if you think that the Democrats are going to reach across the aisle and help them vote to repeal, well, I've got a bridge to sell you. That's not going to happen. So unless the Republicans can pick up 8 more seats in the 2018 midterm elections, the ACA is not getting repealed anytime soon. So what was this all about then? What are they trying to do with this health care bill? Well, that's what's referred to as a reconciliation bill. Reconciliation bills are budget-related bills that can be passed with a simple majority, which they do have in the Senate. These reconciliation bills have to originate from the House, and they can only make changes that impact federal spending and/or revenues. So they do have substantial power to change and to shape the law, but these types of bills cannot make it go away altogether. Some of the ACA provisions that could be changed by a reconciliation bill include the individual and employer mandates, exchange subsidies, Medicaid expansion, and the Cadillac tax. And you'll see that these provisions all have to do with money. They're either taxes or penalties or government spending. These are the types of things that the Republicans can change with a simple majority vote through a reconciliation bill. Okay, so we've laid out a pretty convincing case for why the Republicans want to repeal and replace the ACA. They've been talking about it forever. Many Republican senators and congressmen, even President Trump, ran their campaigns on this very issue. So now we've got a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican in the White House. It's like all of their dreams have finally come true. They can repeal the ACA before breakfast and then move on to tax reform after lunch, right? Well, as we've seen, it has not been that easy. Let's walk through the timeline of everything that's been happening for the past few months. It all started on March 7th when the American Health Care Act, or AHCA, was introduced in the House of Representatives. At this time, the Trump administration immediately came out and announced their support for the bill. They thought it was a good bill and they were 100% behind it. The very next day, on March 8th, the bill was approved in committee. And I'm sure it's no surprise to you that this vote fell along party lines. Most Republicans voted yes, and all of the Democrats voted no. The Democrats on the committees also objected to voting without a CBO score, which we'll get to next. The CBO score was released a few days later on March 12th. So the CBO, in case you're not familiar, is the Congressional Budget Office. They are a nonpartisan group in Washington that evaluates proposed legislation to determine the anticipated financial and economic impacts. According to the CBO, under the AHCA, 14 million more Americans will be uninsured in 2018 as opposed to under the current law. And the report indicates that this big increase in uninsured rate would mostly be attributed to the elimination of the individual mandate. People didn't have to get health insurance anymore, so they weren't going to. And also voluntary terminations of coverage due to high premiums. Remember, we said the average increase is right around 25%. The CBO anticipated people just canceling because they couldn't afford it anymore. But the long-term prospects here weren't any better. They predicted that 52 million more Americans would be uninsured by 2026, as opposed to 28 million they had predicted under the current law. And this is a difference of 24 million people. Per the report, this long-term increase was really largely due to cuts in the Medicaid program. We're going to get into the specifics of the bill later, but a lot of it did have to do with cuts to Medicaid. The only real bright spot in this report was that the CBO expected the bill to reduce the federal deficit by $377 billion over the next decade. So that's huge. That's a lot of savings, which is, part of the main goal for the Republicans here. But that fact was kind of overshadowed by the number of people who stood to lose coverage under that bill. This discouraging CBO score caused the Republicans to make some more revisions to the bill. So they introduced an amendment that made a few big changes to that proposed legislation. This amendment gave states the option to create a work requirement for Medicaid enrollees and to fund adult and child populations using block grants. That would essentially give them a little more freedom to decide who qualifies and for what services. They also added a 30% late enrollment penalty for individual plans. The penalty would be applied to people who were previously uninsured and who were enrolling for coverage during open enrollment. And under this rule, the insurance company could raise their premiums by 30%. After the amendment was adopted, the CBO did update their score. Unfortunately, the resulting score wasn't any better. The revised bill would not cause any drop in the number of uninsured Americans, but it also resulted in a much lower reduction in federal deficits. It was $150 billion, which is still, granted, a ton of money, but that's less than half of the original projection. However, despite receiving another unfavorable CBO score, a House vote was scheduled for March 23rd. Now, this date was significant because it was the 10-year anniversary of the ACA's passing. The vote, however, ended up getting postponed because Republicans could not gain enough support within their own party. At this point, Trump was getting impatient, and he said, you know what, either pass this bill or I'm moving on to other issues. So they did reschedule that vote for the very next day. Which leads us to March 24th, when Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, canceled the scheduled vote and pulled the bill from the floor. At the time, he said he did not expect that bill to survive, or really anything close to that bill to survive. So it looked like it was kind of over. So what went wrong? How did this happen? Well, Republicans have a clear majority in the House, so why couldn't they get that done? One of the main issues seems to be that they just couldn't agree on a replacement plan. There was a lot of infighting, and everyone seemed to sort of have a different idea of what was wrong with the ACA. Some of the hardline conservatives thought the replacement plan was still too generous. They wanted bigger cuts to Medicaid. They wanted to eliminate essential health benefits. But many of the moderates thought that the proposed changes didn't do much to solve the problems that were caused by the ACA. And they were worried about the number of people who could potentially lose coverage due to these changes. So there was just a lot of difference in opinion, even as to when the changes should happen. Some people wanted it right away, if not retroactively. Many others wanted to phase it in slowly. There were entire House committees that opposed this bill. The Freedom Caucus, in particular, played a huge role in the failure to vote. And in the end, they just couldn't arrive at a consensus. The more changes that Trump and Ryan made to try to appease those conservatives, the more they alienated the moderates. And then the conservatives still weren't happy. So in the end, they just didn't have the votes, and that bill was pulled. After the decision was made, very disappointed, Paul Ryan spoke about the growing pains of governing. It's interesting, the Republicans have been the opposition party for so long, and now they're suddenly the ruling party, and they don't have a really clear, cohesive vision for how to move forward. It's really easy to oppose something when you don't have the power to change it. In the past, they voted over and over again, 40 times, I think is the number, to get rid of the ACA, to repeal it. But all that time, they knew full well that it was never going to happen with Obama in the White House. Now, they should be in the clear, but it turns out that they never really had a plan for replacement. And healthcare reform was at the very top of Trump's to-do list, so they kind of had to scramble to get a plan in place and to try to rush that vote through the House. If they'd taken more time drafting that bill, we might have seen a different result. But that's not really how it shook out. So at this point, it really looked like the AHCA was dead. Trump was already impatient with the legislative process, and it seemed like the Republicans were kind of going to take more of a wait-and-see approach to healthcare reform and maybe move on to other issues. Trump was quoted at this time as saying that the best thing they could do, politically speaking, was to let Obamacare explode. We really didn't expect this issue to come up again until midterm elections. In fact, this all happened, March 24th was a Friday. The following Tuesday, I had to give a speech on this very topic, and I stood in front of a group of insurance producers and said, yeah, we don't expect anything to come back up. It's dead. They're moving on. It's not the case. So with all of this in mind, now that we think that it's dead and that ACA is going to be the law of the land for the foreseeable future, the focus kind of shifted a bit towards trying to prop up the failing individual market. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, CMS, which is the regulatory arm of the Department of Health and Human Services, released some guidance that attempt to stabilize the insurance exchanges. They shortened the length of the open enrollment period. They added more pre-verification requirements for special enrollments. They also put some new rules in place with the goal of reducing abuses of the grace period for late premium payments and to allow more plan designs relative to metallic tier status. And they also gave insurance companies more time to file their 2018 plans and rates. Again, the feeling at this time was that the AHCA was dead and the ACA was here to stay, so we'd better concentrate on making it work for everyone. That, however, was not the case. A little more than 1 month later, a new version of the bill was sent to the House floor for a vote, and this time it passed. It was extremely close, though. It only passed 217 to 213, and it will come as a surprise to no one that all of the Democrats voted no to this bill, but so did 20 Republicans, which indicates that there were still some divisions within the party. Just before the main vote, they also voted unanimously to eliminate a provision that exempted members of Congress from certain provisions of the AHCA. You may have heard about this on the news, as it was not very popular with the media or the general public. Originally, they had this clause in there that said that members of Congress and their staff didn't have to sort of comply with some of these rules that they're putting into the AHCA. But I would say wisely, they decided to eliminate this before they actually held the vote. It is interesting to note, though, that this vote took place without the benefit of a CBO score. So their revised bill had not received a score yet, but they went ahead and voted anyway, which is pretty unusual. Usually they wait for that score. But that CBO score actually wasn't even released until 20 days later on May 24th. And this score was pretty similar to the original score in that it predicted pretty much the same uninsured rate. It dropped a little bit from 24 million to 23 million more uninsured than under the current law. And it also projected a much lower reduction of the deficit at 119 billion. And again, 119 billion is a lot of money. That's nothing to sneeze at. But compared to 377 billion under the previous version, that was a pretty big drop in the savings there. It is important to remember, though, that the CBO scores are not an exact science. It's really kind of just educated guessing. You know, some people put a lot of stock into these scores, but many others kind of just wave them off and say, you know what, it's pure speculation, doesn't mean anything. The original CBO score for the ACA was not entirely accurate either. They predicted a much higher exchange enrollment rate than we ultimately ended up seeing. So the CBO scores can be a good indicator, but it's important to kind of take it with a grain of salt as well. But taking all of this into account, all of the sort of deep divides in the Republican Party, the unfavorable scores, how do they get this thing to pass? Well, they made a couple of important changes to the original bill that kind of helped that bill get passed in that May 4th vote. One of them was called the MacArthur Amendment, and this allows states to request waivers opting out of certain ACA provisions. Essentially what they did was they kind of walked back a few of these things, saying that, okay, we're going to keep this provision from the ACA at the federal level, but we're going to let states choose to opt out if they want to. So if a state wanted to, they could request a waiver to increase the age rating ratio from 3:1 to 5:1. They also have the ability to use health status as a rating factor for late enrollees instead of applying the 30% late enrollment penalty. They could also choose to opt out of the federal definition of essential health benefits and create their own definition. So this amendment was huge in getting some of those conservatives on board. In order to get these waivers, the states really just had to say, hey, we want to do this because we think it's going to help bring premiums down. But they did also have to establish a high-risk pool or another similar program. So they had to have that in place in order to request the waivers. They could request all three, they could request one, two, whatever the case was. But this right here, this is what got those conservatives, like the Freedom Caucus, to kind of come around and say, okay, we're going to get on board now. The other big change here was the Upton Amendment. That allocated an additional $8 billion in federal funding to help finance the cost of those high-risk pools. The original version of the bill did include funding for this, but many moderates were concerned that the funding was not enough. So by anteing up another $8 billion to this fund, they were able to get the moderates on board as well. So now that the bill has been passed by the House and it's into the hands of the Senate, let's take a look and see what the AHCA entails. I've kind of broken this down for you by market segment, so you can see exactly how each one would be affected by the bill. The individual market obviously is where it will have the most impact. Most significantly, the individual mandate would be essentially eliminated. People would no longer be required to purchase health insurance or pay a penalty. Now, I do want to make a distinction here, though, that technically the mandate would still be in place. However, the AHCA would negate the penalty. Remember, reconciliation bills can only change budget-related items. So they can't take away that part of the law. They can only sort of erase the penalty. So technically, you'd still have to buy health insurance, but there's no penalty if you don't. They did, however, eliminate the cost-sharing subsidies. These were subsidies under the ACA that helped cover some of the out-of-pocket expenses associated with the health plan. Premium subsidies remain in a sense, but they're significantly changed. Currently, the subsidies are mostly based on income, but going forward, they would be tax credits that were mostly based on age. Previously, the premium subsidies were based on a percentage of the premium for the lowest cost silver plan, but now they're going to be fixed amounts between $2,000 and $4,000 per person to a maximum of $14,000 per family. So younger people would get $2,000, older people would get $4,000. They also raise those income caps quite a bit, so subsidies would theoretically be available to more people. They raised those up to $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for families. Under the ACA, it was calculated as a percentage of the poverty level, but typically for individuals, it was right around maybe $45,000, and for families about $95,000. So they did raise that quite a bit so that more people would have access to these subsidies that really now are tax credits. One interesting thing about the AHCA is that these tax credits can be used on any type of policy. So under the ACA, people can only get subsidies for policies bought on the exchanges. But under this new law, people could use their tax credits for any policy they want, as long as it's allowed by the state. So it could be on exchange, off exchange, even COBRA premiums. So that brings up another interesting point here. Since people will no longer be required to buy policies on the exchange in order to access a subsidy, what's going to happen to exchanges? Are they going to go away? Are they going to stick around? Do we even still need them? It's kind of hard to say. Under the AHCA, open enrollment rules and special enrollment rules would still be in effect. So those are still there, but they did shorten the open enrollment period. So instead of going from November 1st to January 31st, as it was in 2017, it would be changed to November 1st to December 15th. As we mentioned earlier, they did add that 30% late enrollment penalty for individuals with no prior coverage. However, they gave the states the option to request a waiver and opt out of this. So if the state so chose, they could get that waiver and use medical underwriting on these late enrollees instead. Now, guarantee issue, that's still in force, so they can't take that away. People cannot be denied coverage based on their health status, but there's no statutory cap on that rate-up percentage. So if somebody was really sick, you know, the sky's the limit for how much the insurance companies can charge them if the state were to take this waiver. They also eliminated the metallic tiers. So no more bronze, silver, gold, platinum plans. Plans are just plans under this new rule. They also did something with the federal definition of essential health benefits. So basically, it still stands at the federal level, but states can request waivers to set their own definitions. So if a state like Florida wanted to request this waiver, they could sort of pick and choose what they wanted to cover. They could write their own handbook as to what's considered essential and what the coverage has to be. They also allowed states to expand the age rating ratio up to 5-1. Currently, it's at 3-1, but again, if they did these individual waivers, or the state waivers, they could change that to 5-1. Medicaid. Medicaid was also hit pretty hard by this. The Medicaid expansion funding was reduced, and they changed the funding to a fixed per capita amount. Not PEP capita like it says on my slide, per capita amount. They also gave the states the option to opt into a block grant, which would be sort of one lump sum that they could use for the entire year's funding. That gives them a little more freedom to determine, who's eligible and for what services. And they gave the states the option to add a work requirement, and if they did add this work requirement, they would get additional funding. The work requirement would only apply to non-elderly, non-disabled, non-pregnant adults. That's a new term for me, non-pregnant, but so they're not going to make sick people or old people or pregnant ladies go to work to get Medicaid, but if you're able-bodied, these states can require you to work, and then in exchange, they would get additional funding. The group market, there have been some changes here as well. So the employer mandate has been eliminated. Again, technically the mandate still exists, however the penalties have been eliminated. So if an employer does not offer coverage, that's okay, they will not suffer any ramifications. However, employer reporting probably will still exist in some form because the government's going to need to use this reporting to determine who has coverage available to them. So keep that in mind that your applicable large employers may still be required to report. The small business tax credit has been eliminated. The small group age rating, it can also increase to 5-1. So if you've got a small group in the state that's requested that waiver on the age ratio, that could be increased to 5-1 as well. The Cadillac tax. The Cadillac tax is still here. I have to admit I'm a little bit surprised on that. However, they've delayed it again. So it's going to be delayed now until 2026. Again, the states may define those essential health benefits if they've requested the waiver. Those essential health benefits as defined by the state would extend to the group market as well. Some things that have to stay are the 90-day maximum waiting period, dependents covered to age 26, and those SBC requirements. Some other changes they've made here. One of them is HSA expansion. So they've increased the contribution limit to the maximum out-of-pocket of the health plan. They've decreased the penalty for ineligible distributions to 10%, and they've also put some changes in place to sort of expand eligibility. One of them is cutting down on the other types of insurance that make you ineligible to open that HSA. So like Medicare Part A, under this bill, if someone's enrolled in Medicare Part A, they could still have and contribute to a health savings account. They made some changes here to the FSA as well. And one of them was to remove the statutory maximum election for the healthcare FSA. So under the ACA, they imposed a cap on this. It used to be that every employer set their own maximum. There was no statutory max. The ACA did impose a cap on this. The AHCA would take that cap away. They've also wanted to remove the RX requirement for over-the-counter drugs. And speaking as somebody who works with FSAs all the time, who spends a lot of time talking to employees about their FSAs and how they work, these things I think are awesome. I would love to see that requirement go away because it makes things a lot easier for everyone. They also eliminated most of the ACA taxes and penalties. So almost all of those are gone. They did keep the Cadillac tax, but other than that, pretty much everything would be gone under this new version. So that's what's in the bill, and that's what was sent, was passed by the House and sent to the Senate. So what now? What's going to happen next? What can we expect? Well, we've still got a pretty long road to travel before this actually becomes the law. It was a struggle, but they managed to complete step one, which was getting the bill through the House. Now it's with the Senate for approval. But so far, that's not really shaping up to be a walk in the park either. If you think about it, all of the same problems that made passing the House such a big challenge, those still exist in the Senate. The Republicans still really aren't on the same page when it comes to healthcare reform, and everyone kind of seems to have their own agenda. What makes it more difficult is that they only have a 2-seat majority in the Senate, so they can only afford to lose 2 votes. In that case, if they lose 2, Pence can break the tie. But if they lose any more than that, it's over. And at this point, the opinions are so widely varied that it kind of doesn't seem like getting to 50 votes is going to be a guarantee. Some of the points of contention here sort of seem to be, one, the timing of the changes. Are we going to do this right away? Are we going to phase it out slowly? What to do about Medicaid? Medicaid expansion and cutting the funding, that's kind of a big deal to a lot of people. A lot of them want larger subsidies for older people. They are worried about these pre-existing condition rules. That's something we hear in the media over and over about pre-existing conditions and charging people more who have them. And then some of them, they may want to preserve some of these taxes from the ACA because you have to pay for this somehow. So how are we going to pay for all of this if we don't have any taxes, if we don't have any penalties? Where's that money going to come from? So we could see some changes there. And at this point, though, we know very little about what the Senate might do here. And that's because there's a 13-member healthcare working group that is sort of hammering out their new draft behind closed doors. They're rumored to be close to finalizing their version and sending it off to the CBO for a score, but no one outside this committee has even seen the bill or knows what's in it. And it's possible that we might not know until after the score has been released. So it's all kind of being done in secret. They're not really putting anything out there for the public or even really for the rest of the Senate. So that's really different from what we normally see. Compounding that even further is the fact that the Senate Republicans have invoked what's called Senate Rule 14 to try and fast track this legislation. Basically, this rule allows the bill to go straight to the full Senate for a vote as soon as it's finalized and receives its CBO score. There will be no committee process, no hearings or debate in the full Senate, just straight to a vote. If you compare this to the ACA, in that case, the Senate Health Committee spent 13 days marking up the bill, and the full Senate debated for 25 days. So obviously, things are not working quite the same this time around. Keep in mind, too, that if the Senate does pass a bill, it still needs to go back to the House for another vote because they will have made changes. If the House doesn't pass that as is, it will need to go to a committee that's made up of House members and Senate members, and they'll have to sort of hammer out the differences and come up with a version that everyone can agree on. But that process could take a while, and it's possible that that bill might not even ever make it out of committee. So we've still got a long ways to go. Nothing is really set in stone at this point. There's also a lot of political considerations. The Republicans, they have a lot riding on this. Many of them have been campaigning on repealing the ACA for years, and they really feel like they owe it to their constituents to keep their promise. But others are concerned that there's such a negative perception of the AHCA, and that publicly supporting it could really hurt their chances for re-election. For a while there, every time you turn on the TV, the media was up in arms about this, about all the changes that are being proposed. We've got people protesting, we've got people going to town halls and attacking their representatives. Trump himself, who has historically supported this legislation and has really been pushing to get something passed, he recently came out and said, you know what, that House bill is mean. He thought it was mean. So the tide is kind of turning on that a little bit, 22 of the Republican senators also represent states where Medicaid was expanded under the ACA. So for them to support legislation that includes big cuts to Medicaid would not be in the best interest of their constituents. It really can't be overstated. I cannot say this enough. With this current political climate, voting for a bill of this nature, it could be a risky proposition. People are fired up. People are getting involved. They're getting angry. Yesterday morning, someone opened fire on a group of Republican congressmen practicing for a charity baseball game. Things like this, they might make these senators a little less likely to support something that they know is not the most popular. And it could be a major challenge to get this bill through the Senate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, he's been quoted as saying that he doesn't know how they're going to get to 50 votes. He doesn't see how it's going to happen. There's also been some speculation lately that I've been reading that the Senate may approach what they call, or adopt what they call, a show them a body approach, which would be basically scheduling a vote that they know is going to fail, just so they can say, hey, we tried, couldn't make it happen, and then finally be done with this whole thing. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen, but there is this sense that they do really need to push something through. We know they're anxious to move on to tax reform. But if they can't get this AHCA passed first, tax reform is going to be a lot more difficult. The question is, if they do push something through, what's it going to look like in the end? And honestly, it's really too soon to tell. But definitely know that there's going to be probably a lot of twists and turns along the way. So until something passes in both chambers, the ACA is still the law of the land. So it is still in effect. But it's important to remember that there's a difference between passing a law and enforcing or regulating it. So just because the Republicans might not be able to repeal and replace the ACA right now doesn't mean that they can't shape the law and make changes to the way that it's enforced. We've already seen some of this since Trump took office. First, there was his executive order. On his very first day in office, he issued an executive order which basically instructed agency officials to not enforce any of the taxes and penalties of the ACA. Basically said, you know what? Don't enforce it. Then the IRS came out and said, okay, we're going to accept tax returns even if the insurance status was omitted. And this was a huge change because under the Obama administration, if you sent in a tax return and you didn't complete the insurance information, they would just reject it outright. What this administration has done is they said, okay, if you don't fill it out, no big deal, we'll still take it, we'll still process it. Now, if you fill it out and say, hey, I have no health insurance, the penalty would still apply. But if you just forget to mention it, then nothing would happen to you. There's also that CMS guidance we talked about a little bit earlier, where they changed the dates for open enrollment. So a lot more things could change, even if the bill doesn't get passed, especially if the individual market continues to decline. I'd say it's a pretty safe bet that if we see this sort of what they've been calling it a death spiral at some points, if we see that continuing, the Trump administration is going to sort of have to step in with more regulatory action. They're probably going to have to do something about the fact that there are areas of this country where there are no insurance plans available on the exchange, 45 counties. So that's a big deal. They're probably going to have to do some sort of regulatory action to try to correct that. Exactly what they might do, though, that remains to be seen. It's really hard to say for sure what would happen. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. But where does that leave us in terms of the ACA? For right now, we're pretty much in a wait-and-see mode. We'll keep you guys updated, though, so we will make sure to keep you updated on any changes as they occur. Make sure if you don't already, you follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can subscribe to our blog at flexiblebhenefit.com, and we will send you the latest updates. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open this up for questions now. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send them in using the questions function on your webinar control panel. And I'm going to pause just for a minute here to see if we get any questions. Okay, so we do have a question here that says, is this being taped so we can listen to it again? Yes, it is being recorded. We will follow up with you with a copy of the recording and also a copy of the presentation as well. So we will be sending that up in a follow-up email. We have a question here that says, will we be able to sell short-term plans again for up to a year as opposed to up to 90 days? Yeah, actually, they just had something about this recently. They requested it, so it's something that's in the works. They're trying to get this to happen. Most likely, I would say probably. It's not official at this point, but I know that it is something that is in the works. So stay tuned for more news on that. That should be coming out soon. Someone's asking for clarification, what is the CBO? The CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. They're an independent, nonpartisan group in Washington, and their job is to evaluate proposed legislation and to sort of predict the economic impacts of that legislation. So they've been involved with the healthcare bill, and they released what's called a score. And in the score, they say, here's what we think is going to happen. This many people will gain or lose coverage, this much money is going to be saved. So that's something that legislators take into account when they're, debating the bill and making changes. I have a question here. Do you have a list of counties with no marketplace plans? I don't have that really handy, but that's something we can find for you. I think I read that they're mostly in like Ohio and Kentucky. I don't think any of them were here in Illinois, but that's something that we can do to follow up. We've got your information here, Mark, so we'll make sure to send you some info on that as well. Is there an idea of when we will know which, if any, changes will be taking place? Great question. So again, it's all kind of being done secretly, so we don't have a great idea. There's been a lot of speculation that the Senate does want to sort of wrap this up before the August recess. So people I've talked to said most likely we would see something by the end of July. But I have also read some people are saying before the July 4th break, so that would be a lot sooner. Probably we will see something by the end of the summer, so do keep tuned for that. But again, it could happen any day. They kind of sprung that May 4th vote on us, so it could happen that they just all of a sudden go to a vote, and it happens really quickly, or it could take a little while longer. So it's so hard to say, but most likely we're anticipating before the August recess. Okay, so in the event the Senate passes the bill and the House passes it, how soon do you believe this could take effect? Well, that's a great question, because some things would take effect, like in the House version of the bill, they wanted to eliminate the individual mandate and employer mandate penalties retroactive to January of 2016. But other things like the changes in the individual market, those wouldn't start until 2018 or 2019 even for some of them. The Medicare cuts, some of those were going to be phased out. And we are hearing that a little bit from the Senate right now, that they do want to phase out ending the Medicare expansion over a few years. They don't want to do it automatically. So some things would happen right away, some things would happen in a few years, some things would happen over the course of a few years. So we would have to wait and see, but most things would probably take effect in the next year or two. Can we share the recording of this webinar with clients? Sure, I'd be happy to. That's fine. Feel free. Okay, what type of rate increases might we be looking at in 2018 with Blue Cross? When will they submit their rates for approval? Open enrollment is from November. Oh, sorry, that's a different question. I'm really not sure. I don't really know what kind of increases we should anticipate from Blue Cross or from any of the other carriers that we work with. It's really hard to say. Originally, they were supposed to have their rates and plans filed for approval by, I think it was June 20th, but the CMS guidance did give them more time to do that. I don't know for sure when exactly they have to be filed, but we can follow up with that information and let you know for sure. I'll also talk to our sales folks and see if they have an idea of what types of increases we might be seeing, but at this time I really couldn't say. Open enrollment is from November 1st through December 15th for next year. That is correct. So CMS did release that. That was final guidance. So for the 2018 open enrollment, it will run from November 1st through December 15th. There's a question here, isn't a shorter enrollment period counterproductive? What's the benefit of doing this? That's a great question. I'm not exactly sure what the thinking was here, but I do think, honestly, it's to limit the number of people who can enroll. They have less time to enroll, so if they are going to do it, they got to do it more quickly. There won't be people who are enrolling at 11 p.m. on January 31st anymore. I just think they're trying to limit the number of people who are signing up, which I guess you're right. I guess that is counterproductive because that might upset the pool. So I don't really know, because obviously people who are sick and who really need coverage are going to make sure they enroll by the deadline. So great question. I'm not exactly sure what the thinking is there. What changes to Medicare, if known? So this bill does not mention Medicare at all, other than in the context of people who are on Medicaid and Medicare, and they would get less money. So really there are no changes to Medicare. So for those of you who sell in the Medicare market, it's a great time to do that because nothing is going to be impacted by any changes that are going to be made to the healthcare legislation. Under the new proposal, being that the open enrollment period is so short, will the carriers allow a preview of plans to us as brokers? I don't know that answer, Karen. I'm sorry, but again, I can ask around and see if anyone here has some insight to that, and we can follow up with you. Any information about extending? Wait, where did it go? Sorry. I think it's extending like the grandfather to the grandmothered plans. Where did it go? The existence of current individual plans still on the books that were written from 2010 to the end of 2013, ACA, but still underwritten. No, I haven't heard anything about that yet. That's something that is typically that they would leave up to the states, and the states were to decide. So the original legislation said, hey, states can decide if they want to do this or how they want to handle it. So that's something that probably Illinois would decide at some point, what's going to happen to those plans. But I don't know for sure. Hopefully we should have some more information about that in the near future. Are they going to increase commissions for selling ACA plans? I don't know. Commissions and insurance producers, consultants, brokers, none of that has been mentioned at all in any of this legislation. My guess is probably no. The commissions being decreased or stopped in some cases are really due to the losses these carriers are taking. And I'm thinking that I don't think even if this bill goes through, the market's not going to turn around that fast. So my guess is it's probably going to be status quo for a while. But if we do see a rebound, that might change in the future. But at this point, it's really hard to say. We have a question here, what is a Cadillac tax? The Cadillac tax is a 40% excise tax on employer health plans that exceed a certain monetary limit. So basically, it's taxing employers who offer health plans that are too rich. So those, you may have heard them called Cadillac plans in the past. That's why they're calling it the Cadillac tax. That's actually not the official name. I think the official name is just excise tax. But basically, it's a rule that says, hey, employers, if you offer a plan that's too generous, we're going to tax you 40% on anything over this limit that we set. So this rule has been delayed several times already. It was supposed to start in 2018, then it was pushed to 2020. Under this new proposed bill, it's being pushed to 2026. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens. It may get delayed again. It may come into effect. We'll have to see. Okay, and it looks like that might be all of the questions that have come in. Let me just check one more place in case anything else is here. Nope, looks like we are good. So I'm going to go ahead and end things here. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. And again, we will follow up with you via email with a copy of the presentation and a link to the recording. If you do have any questions or need any information, please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is here on the screen. And again, I can't recommend enough. Make sure that you follow us on Facebook or Twitter, and go to flexiblebenefit.com and sign up for our blog, because we do post a lot of great information here, and we will keep you updated as things change with the healthcare law. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day.